what the meaning is of the poem. I guess the only phrase we haven't talked about, I've described this as a 5-stanza poem up to this point. We should, however, note the almost afterthought or postscript El Alamein at the end there. Now, the IB never expects you to know geographical or historical detail at any depth, and in fact, if the phrase was there and of importance to the passage, it probably would be there as a kind of a definition on the end. But those of you that do history or have an historical interest might be familiar with El Alamein as one of the big kind of turning battles of World War II. So it might be important to note that in terms of, we know we're in the Gulf of the Arabs, we know El Alamein is in North Africa, which would be one in the Arab countries. So we could presumably, this poem certainly could connect to that idea. If we then carry on to the S in mnemonic, we find we should be exploring slang or particular jargon in the poem. And I think we could probably say that this is written to sort of a common man type audience where there's no specific audience and the jargon is adjusted for any specific purpose. So we might leave our S behind and move on to the P for punctuation. And obviously what's striking here is the mixture of, it's written almost as prose in the sense that we use enjambment at times, at some other instances, semicolons and commas and full stops are used to end stop the lines. It's really about the message of the line rather than the punctuation itself. However, there are clearly some aspects where the punctuation really does emphasize the message of the poem or add to the message of the poem. And I would definitely focus on the 2 hyphens, the one after begin and the one after unknown seaman, and see what's the effect of those 2, the hyphens. And you might also want to look at some of the other punctuation in terms of the stop at the end of the lines. So with my discussion on the effect of the punctuation into sentence length and enjambment, I've kind of moved into the next letter in our little rhyme, the S for sentence length. So we might skip that point and move on to the R for rhythm. And that's really about the sound of the poem. And we've already talked a little bit about the verse and the meter, which is not quite regular. But we clearly see that the 3rd line of each stanza is significantly longer. Given the regularity of those lengthy lines, it's worth exploring whether there is a rhythmical pattern to them and whether there is actually a distinct meter in them. So we'll have a little bit of a feel at them. At night they sway and wander in the waters far under. So you would say that at they and the and under are not stressed, but even so, we could divide this into iambs. I think we could say that that's an iamb. We can say that's an iamb loosely, but this one obviously at the end here is not strictly iambic. So I would say we don't need to sort of go into the meter as being any significant influence in those lines. Just the fact that they are slightly longer and breaking up the rhythm of the line rather than trying to enforce a particular rhythm. What is more interesting and more relevant in this poem, I think, is to sound out the other noises and the other sounds of the poem and see what they do in relation to the meaning of the poem. And I think particularly then of assonance and maybe to some extent alliteration as well. Because there are definitely some sounds that are a bit stronger than others and add to that sense of longing and loss. What you will find, I think, if you look closely, is that there are a lot of long vowel sounds, a lot of U sounds and long O sounds that all add that sort of sense of even sway is quite a long sound rather than sort of a short and snappy one. There's not many kind of I, wi, u, ah sounds, but rather long, like wander, clubbing, someone, pluck, burrows. There's this kind of there's a sense of assonance going through, even though the sounds are not exactly the same. They're quite long, and some of them do definitely. But I might let you look at that later on. I've given you an impression of the sounds, and you can certainly go into greater detail on and see which sounds are more prominent and which ones continually come back throughout the poem. If instead we move on to the next point, which is the imagery aspect, it is worth to look at just the types of imagery. We can see that there's quite a lot of visual imagery. We do get to see visually the beach and the sailors and the crosses, and we also get to hear some of the sounds. We hear the sob and the clubbing of the gunfire. We get the soft and humbleness, which is in the first stanza, and there are a few. There's the dripping, etc. So there's definitely some sounds going through. There's a breath coming through, etc. And there are some visual imagery, but there's not, as one might expect in this kind of poem, there isn't much olfactory or gustatory image. There's no taste, there's no smells really. Some of the imagery we could maybe move into tactile, but it's not really describing touch or feel as such. If you then look at the kind of the bullet points that we listed under imagery, we talked about stimulus, metaphors, and personification, none of which we really see in this poem. However, if we look at hyperbole, there are a few almost hyperbolic phrases in the poem that I think are worth. For instance, the convoys of the dead, I think is kind of interesting. It's also worth looking at the ambiguity of those words that we highlighted earlier when we talked about vocabulary, and see what's the effect of those, and particularly maybe the sob and the clubbing of the gunfire, and whether the guns are actually almost a bit sad at what they're doing. There's almost a sense of maybe synesthetic quality here, that we're mixing sound with feeling in that line, potentially. A few other places as well that we almost, the senses seem to be a little bit mixed up in terms of what we're seeing and what we're feeling and what we're hearing. It's not entirely clear which sense is actually picking up some of these impressions. And I think also we talked previously about the ambiguous phrase of plucking them from the shallows and burying them in burrows, and how that's kind of, you bury someone in a place that should really be a sheltering, safety place. So if we're not going to try to bring these ideas into some kind of closure and maybe use our mnemonic now as a structuring element to actually set up a commentary, we talked initially how the poem was kind of somber and the mood had a sense of mourning about it, and we could relate that to the form, which is almost like an elegy. I think we could also tie that to the assonance and to the description of the setting, and what actually seems to have happened here in terms of the plot. We can explore the vocabulary and how there's a sense of the vocabulary being a bit frustrated and somewhat contradictory in terms of there's a slight disconnect between feelings and meaning at times. We might then try to relate this to the speaker, the voice of the speaker, and his relation to the other personas, and finally we could then conclude it all in the last reference to El Alamein, and how that could be the influence for the whole thing, and that would be kind of a nice closing reference, I think, to talk about how this potentially could be about that particular event. So as you can see, I've slightly changed the order of some of those points on the mnemonic, but I'm roughly going from large to small. We've got the turn of the mood initially, but then I moved to assonance and description because that's sort of supporting the turn of the mood. And then I went from there to vocabulary before talking about the speaker and the personas and the kind of connection between them. But you could just as well, I think it just links better in my mind in that way. But if you were to do it, go exactly in the order of the mnemonic, so you went from narrative stance to form to vocabulary, you could probably still create a very cohesive argument. Having said all that, the whole point of the mnemonic is just to give you support. It's not meant to be constrictive and forcing you into a particular structure, but rather if you can do a conceptual study, if you were to go through and look at the ideas in the poem and then tie your evidence to that, and maybe tone doesn't come in until the very last stanza, maybe the mood isn't mentioned at all, and maybe instead you start off with the imagery which creates a certain effect. That is absolutely a valid structure, and it's just whatever suits your particular purpose with your commentary. So I hope this has been to some help for you in terms of how to apply and use your mnemonic to write effective literary commentaries, because it will be a very useful skill for you. So it is important that you start mastering this early on. So I'm hoping that you've found this commentary instruction of some use, and that you can now head off into the world of the IB and write really effective commentaries of your own. Best of luck. See you next time.